All these explanations of the gospel as the result of an inner evolution forget one thing, namely that Jesus grew up within Judaism and so on a sharply anti-mystical soil, where no one had the audacity to attempt to find God or to enjoy him in the depths of his own soul, or to unite himself with the cosmos through reflection. Prophets and psalmists, those servitors in the service of God, whose words the growing child heard and learned in the synagogues of Nazareth, were no mystics, no teachers of secret sapientia, whose taste should bring the soul to God. In its service, the congregation was always reminded of Moses, who, because of the divine wisdom that had been forced on him, in faith forsook the riches of Egypt and chose to share the reproach of his fathers and brethren. The prophetic messages of Isaiah and Amos attacked all efforts to reach God through some sort of religious technique, through ecstasy or magic, even the belief in ethical merits. The expectation of salvation through the keeping of the law had been largely shattered among the devout by the teachings of the penitential psalms and through God's judgments as they have been manifested in the history of the nation. In place of the crisis in other religions that caused men to turn to mysticism and Gnosticism, we have the messianic eschatology of Judaism. We find incarnation, not apotheosis, the hope that of God's appearance on earth, and the consequent removal of enmity and the establishment of a real communion with him. How then does Jesus differ fundamentally from all others who have been founders of some form of religion? He does not give directions for purification of the soul like those which in all mystery religions are accounted the indispensable condition for any communion with divinity. He does not point to men to the creative springs within his own soul, that through them he might find the satisfaction of devotion. He does not make wisdom and virtue conditions of his fellowship. Just the opposite is true. Without regard to any moral attainments, spiritual fervor, or intellectual wisdom, he receives sinners and eats with them. His attitude toward the fallen world and toward those still in the bondage and servitude of sin is one of unconditional compassion, and to them he preaches the word of pardon that he offers to the world with the power of a divine omnipotence. Outside of Judaism, such a message was largely incomprehensible, where sin is regarded only as a weakness or as a relative defect that could always be overcome and atoned for by an active exercise of self-discipline and by the merit of good deeds. The word of forgiveness can only mean the declaration of the rational truth of God's graciousness, which is evident even to pure reason, or else the pleasant and comforting assurance that God was not so very particular about the required exertions, a pleasant mitigation that necessarily ends in moral laxity. In the Old Testament piety, the attitude is a different one. Here, men are sure that if every sin is an affront to God's majesty and a mocking of his holy will, then forgiveness can neither be taken for granted nor be acquired. Only a single way of salvation still lies open, a way that man himself does not control. Namely, when God himself, through a paradoxical, free, Greek word I can't pronounce, which cannot be forced nor set in motion by any human means, decides to overlook and pardon sin, and so by his act makes communion possible. The statement to a palsied Israelite, "Son, be of good cheer, thy sins are forgiven thee," could only be the words of a blasphemer or the words of God himself. In Israel, the proclamation of the remission of guilt could never mean that the fear of God is only a fancy springing from an unwholesome, unhealthy exaggeration of the fears of conscience, which needs only to be overcome to enable man to live with free assurance in the gracious light of divine love. This religious fallacy has been once for all excluded and forbidden in the Bible by the terrible seriousness of its warnings concerning judgment, as they are found in the messages of the great prophets and in the eschatological discourses of Jesus. When Jesus brings forgiveness unconditionally, He can only do so because he knows that he has come from the one who is the source of the free decree of love, and that he is in unity with him, because he knows that he is indeed the coming Messiah, in whom God anew approaches the humanity that has become estranged from his will. The miracle of his presence is the pledge that God has taken pity on the world. He has not constituted himself the reconciler, but God has appointed him. His word of the absolution is fully established on his absolute knowledge of him and his own mission, the consciousness of which even the synoptic gospels are fully aware. From the certainty that God, the living Lord of history, will create something absolutely new through his life and death in the world, becomes the absoluteness of his claim by which he constrains both the individual and the whole world to make a decision concerning himself, a decision that involves eternal consequences. With this consciousness of a mission that includes heaven and earth, he bears the offense of his humiliation to the very end, and so abolishes all the standards of this present perishing aeon. The piercing, but I say to you, of his discourses, the power of his miracles of healing, as he conquers the demons, sickness, and death, are like pledges of divine reconciliation, as well as the eschatological assurance that the kingdom which has been established by his presence shall finally fill the whole earth, bearing the burden and the wretchedness of the sin of all mankind. He travels in obedient love. The way to the cross, there is there to reveal to men judgment on mankind through the judgment that men pronounce on him, and by his death discloses the justice of God, the injustice of man. He who has been faithful unto death by conquering death rises out of the power of death with the glorified corporeal nature that has been made, the Greek word, by God. The promise of a perpetual Easter that has been given by God to his reconciled creation. So we see clearly the profound contrast between Jesus' message and his works, and all other founders of religions. He makes the claim that as the reconciler mediating between God and man, he is the turning point of the ages. He is not content to be one among many doors that lead to the Father's house, or one way among a number of possible roads, but he calls himself the door, the way, that alone leads to true communion with God. He is the only bridge on which man can cross the abyss of sin that separates him from God. He is the foundation that alone supports our tottering existence. This is in fact so unique, so overwhelming, so obnoxious, that we must either believe it or else be offended by it. Even for faith, there often comes times when the absolutely unconditional character of this bond threatens to become an offense, when it has to wrestle with the temptation of thinking that this might all be an illusion. But whether we adoringly believe in his plenary power to remit sins, or blaspheme it as an insanity, much has been gained when we once clearly see that here are two opposite worlds of which it is necessary to choose one or the other, because they have nothing whatsoever in common. On the one side are the unhistorical religions of salvation, whose founders are only significant as mystagogues, and which on that account are tolerant and animated by a moral pragmatism and optimism. On the other side is the gospel, whose founder not only obligates us to his teachings, but also to the historical facts of his incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection, who makes his demands unconditionally, who dashes us to the ground by way in which he unmasks the supposed holiness of man, but who also bestows perfect communion with God through his pardon-bringing presence to those who accept him in faith. We can make this contrast between the gospel and the non-Christian efforts to attain salvation and sanctification still clearer if we include the message of the apostles in our comparison. We have already indicated the fact that wherever they went, in the course of their missionary journeys, they found themselves surrounded by a spiritual world that was filled with an extraordinary desire for deification. As Jews, their opinions had been molded in their youth by the moral strictness and zeal of the law, And that was shown by great teachers like Hillel, Shammai, and Gamaliel. Amid the filth and modern cities of that day, they saw the Stoic and Neo-Pythagorean schools striving after divine purification through aesthetic self-development. Wandering preachers of moral philosophy at their sides preached a new ethical reform, and in Rome, the ambition of the Caesars for universal domination was acclaimed as a means of saving the world. Innumerable cults, by means of an exalted or refined stimulation of the emotions, by the inflaming of the erotic impulses, as well as through the purifying consecrations and rites, were supposed to impart supernatural powers and a mystical deification. An elaborate mythology, dualistic in the Persian cult of Mithra, monastic in the Alexandrian school of wisdom, satisfied the urge for super sensuous knowledge, and even made its appearance in the Judean homeland. The messengers of Jesus continually came into contact with these ecstatic possibilities, nor did they treat them altogether with contempt. They saw in them, at least in their more exalted form, a manifestation of the longing and seeking of man's soul for its lost home, a pitiful striving and seeking after the unknown God, who had never let mankind slip completely out of his reach, who had given it this restlessness of heart and had filled it with the desire to come from shadowy appearances and delusions to full certainty and real communion with him. One thing the apostles understood clearly, that such homesickness and longing after God cannot find contentment through the heart itself, because it is in itself deceitful and desperately wicked. Jeremiah 17:9. And is continually being tossed back and forth between presumption and despair. So they had no intention of revealing by their message that whole multitude of emotional mystagogues, or the teachers of ethics and wisdom. What gave them the right, the courage, and the gladness of heart to go into all the world and pour out their lives like a living libation was the certainty that they were bringing something absolutely new, a Greek word which I can't pronounce, with which no other message could be compared, and which alone could bring peace to the deepest longings of mankind. With the grammatical forms that refer to actual occurrences, the indicative and aorist participles, they proclaim the marvel of a communion that has been established with God through reconciliation. What men have not been able to reach through any spiritual art or by their own wisdom and dexterity, God has made possible by his sovereign intervention, and has given it to all the world, and furthermore has done so while we were yet dead in sins. Ephesians 2:5. Quite independently of our spiritual condition, to say nothing of our cooperation. The just dies for the unjust, and God himself established a new relationship in Christ that is always and everywhere valid. Romans 5:18, and also 1 Peter 3:18. And this historic revelation of God in Christ, and the historic fact that the cross and resurrection by which sin is judged and vanquished in real transaction lies in certainty of their communion with God that the original messengers possessed. And this is the source of their joy in carrying out their mission. Christ is more to St. Paul than a mere symbol of truth that is valid in itself. Jesus is not simply like Osiris, a timeless myth that served in the history of human thought to depict the coming of life and death, but through the real historic fact of his death, through his victory over the principalities and powers of this world, he actually produces an entirely new situation through which judgment is changed into salvation. The repeated Greek word, another Greek word, of the epistles is clear proof that the apostles' Christ is not merely a universal truth manifested in historic form, but that he is a nudum factum, which brings about a sharply defined transition from once to now, from the past to the present, and which gives a new turn to the whole course of time and history in this aeon. Between a theology grounded on the facts of salvation and one that is founded on latent truths that are superior to events in history, yawns an abyss that we should never attempt to bridge by any sort of dialectic.